Hi everybody. Since I'm not here this week, I thought I would record these notes for you so that it would be a little better like I was here. So today we're going to take some notes on cellular respiration. These notes go on page 137 of your biology notebook. I may go a little fast, so feel free to watch this over and over again and stop it and start it as much as you need. All right, so today's topic is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria of both animal and plant cells. Now, this is a big misunderstanding people have. A lot of people think that cellular respiration only happens in an animal cell, but it happens in both plant and animal cells in the mitochondria. The difference is this: an autotroph is an organism that can use photosynthesis, like a plant, to make its own sugar, its own glucose. They use the glucose then in their mitochondria to burn that sugar to produce ATP energy. In a heterotroph like you and I, animals have to eat things to get their glucose. So they can't do photosynthesis, but they still have to find a way to get glucose. That glucose is then used in the mitochondria to do cellular respiration and produce ATP. So both animals and plant cells are doing cellular respiration. The difference is how they get their sugar. All right, so here is the chemical formula for cellular respiration. Now, this should look somewhat familiar because we just talked about photosynthesis. And if you look, you can see it's kind of the exact opposite of photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water were taken in, and glucose and oxygen were produced. Here, you take in oxygen and glucose into the mitochondria, carbon dioxide is produced, water is produced, and a whole bunch of ATP is produced. That's the goal of cellular respiration, to make ATP. Now, there are two basic stages of cellular respiration that you need to understand. Stage one is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose into a more simple sugar. So your mitochondria really can't deal with glucose, C6H12O6. It's too big. So instead, we have glycolysis occur, and it takes the glucose and it breaks it in half, basically. This occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, not actually in the mitochondria. It does not need oxygen, so specifically glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose, doesn't need oxygen. It just happens in the cytoplasm. So what happens is one glucose, which has 6 carbons, is broken down into 2 molecules. Each molecule, a pyruvate it's called, has 3 carbons. So step 1 was to take the glucose and break it into 2-pyruvate. The next step, or stage 2, is to produce ATP. Now, there's 2 ways this can happen: if there's oxygen or if there's no oxygen. So first we'll talk about if there is oxygen. This is what we want to happen, all right? We want oxygen to be present. So if there is oxygen, we call it the citric acid cycle, or sometimes it's called the Krebs cycle. So this is also, a third name, is called aerobic respiration. That means there's oxygen present. And in aerobic respiration, first of all, it occurs in the mitochondria. And the pyruvate is used to change something called ADP into ATP. So let me explain that a little bit. Now, it's like this, these are the molecules to store energy. This right here is ADP. D meaning di, meaning 2 phosphates. Now, here's what happens. This is like an empty battery. You have 2 phosphates. So through aerobic respiration, what happens is an extra phosphate, a P, is added to ADP. When you have 3 phosphates, we now call that ATP. So this is the empty battery. This is the charged battery. So then what happens after you, in cellular respiration, when you make ATP, then the ATP molecule goes to where it's needed and the opposite occurs. You rip this bond apart, releasing a whole bunch of energy. Then this gets reused later on to make ATP again, and it's a little cycle. So during aerobic respiration, happens in the mitochondria, the pyruvate is burned to take that energy and take ADP and make it into ATP. So in the end, in aerobic respiration, a ton of ATP is made. Now, what if there's no oxygen? All right, so this is called anaerobic respiration. It's also sometimes referred to as fermentation. Not as much ATP is made, but at least some is, so you can keep going for a short time. Now, there are two types of fermentation, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So first of all, there's lactic acid fermentation. Now, I put a picture of someone running here, all right? So this is a process, lactic acid fermentation, used by humans in anaerobic conditions. So if you're running at a high speed for a long time, you run out of oxygen. Your cells can't bring in enough oxygen from you breathing in enough time, because as you work out, your body requires oxygen to do cellular respiration. And if you run out of oxygen, instead of just collapsing, your body switches over to lactic acid fermentation. Now again, you make a little bit of ATP, not as much, but you also build something called lactic acid. And this lactic acid is what partially responsible for causing sore muscles when you work out. So I hope many of you have probably experienced this, but when you're running or working out, especially when you haven't done it in a while, the next day you're really sore. That's because you were in lactic acid fermentation. All right, now the other kind of fermentation is called alcohol fermentation. Now, alcohol fermentation is when yeast and bacteria eat and do cellular respiration. So the byproduct of alcohol fermentation is, believe it or not, alcohol, and it's specifically something called ethanol. It also forms carbon dioxide. Now, for bread, we put yeast in bread and bacteria in bread sometimes when we cook it. The alcohol burns off because it's being cooked. But what happens, well, the reason we put it in there is that the yeast, when they eat, they also produce carbon dioxide, which are these bubbles right here, right? So you see the little half of the bubble, which makes the bread rise. We also use this in alcoholic beverages because if you give yeast or bacteria sugar, they produce alcohol. You can collect that, and that's how they make wine and beer and whiskey and all those other things. All right, well, thank you. Remember, go back and listen to this as much as you need. Try to fill out all the notes on page 137. Thank you.